of a new book entitled Give Smart, Philanthropy That Gets Results, written by two of the thought leaders in American philanthropy, Tom Tierney and Joel Fleishman. First, our customary preview of coming attractions. Once again this year, the Center on Philanthropy at Indiana University has chosen the Bradley Center as its partner here in Washington, D.C. to introduce the new numbers on charitable donations compiled on behalf of Giving USA. So on June 23rd, mark your calendars, June 23rd, shortly after the release of the new numbers, we'll hold a panel identical to the one marking the release of last year's numbers. That is to say, it will be moderated by Stacy Palmer from the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and it will include Patrick Rooney, who's director of the Indiana's Center on Philanthropy, Wendy McGrady of the Curtis Group, Tom Pollock of the Urban Institute, and Ruth McCambridge of the Nonprofit Quarterly. Now, for today's panel, in a recent interview at Huffington Post, Tom Tierney argued that, as he put it, giving money away is easy, giving money away smartly so that it not only gets results, but also gets better results over time is hard. The social problems, he goes on, the social problems philanthropy aims to address can be astonishingly complex. You are almost always working with and through other organizations. Strategies are often unproven. There is no real market feedback to guide you. Resources always feel inadequate given your goals, and it can be confounding to measure exactly how you are doing. How to tackle these daunting problems is the subject of Tom's new book, Give Smart, and we're fortunate indeed to have him with us today to discuss it, and we're fortunate to have a distinguished panel of discussants to help us wrestle with these problems. After Tom's opening remarks, we'll hear from Christy Kimball of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, who arrived at 5 a.m. this morning and will be catching a late afternoon flight back. I'd like to think it's a tribute to the importance of the Bradley Center that she's willing to do this, but I think it's a tribute to her new motherhood, right? You're trying to get back to your son. Is that yes, good. Back to her son in California. And then we'll hear from Jeff Kane, who's president of the Arthur Roop Foundation and publisher of Philanthropy Daily, and another West Coast participant who flew out this morning and will be going back today from Seattle. I should add that I was notified this morning that Ralph Smith of the Annie E. Casey Foundation, who is scheduled to be on the panel, couldn't be with us because of a family emergency. So if you're here exclusively to see Ralph Smith, you may leave now if you so desire. But if you're here to hear a terrific conversation on Tom Tierney's new book, this is the place. And incidentally, the book is for sale in the back of the room for the low price of $15. I think it's a retail value of $23.95, right? So you get it for $15 here. I'm not sure. How do we arrange that? It's the bookseller's discount? Yes, okay, that's good. Anyway, so Tom Tierney.
Thank you. I've got about 10 or 15 minutes, and I'm going to toss a few ideas out, starting with a little bit of my own background so you can calibrate my limitations, and then hopefully we'll have a productive and useful discussion. By way of background, I'm actually a business person by training. I ran a company called Bain & Company through most of the 1990s. In 1984, Bain had spun out an investment company that some people have heard of because it was run by a guy named Mitt Romney. And I had the idea in the 90s of spinning out an entity along those same lines, but not a for-profit entity that was a private equity firm, but rather a nonprofit entity that would help improve the performance of philanthropists, foundations, and NGOs. So I stepped down in 2000 as chief executive of Bain to join what was then a four-person charitable startup. Needless to say, I've learned a lot in these last 11 years and am still learning. Part of Bridgespan's strategy is to educate as well as to directly serve, and this book, Give Smart, is in that theme of helping people help themselves. My co-author, Joel Fleishman, not here today, very thoughtful, very experienced professor of public policy at Duke University, wrote the book, The Foundation. He and I teamed up on this effort to try to create a little bit of a line of sight on philanthropy. So Joel studied extensively 20th century philanthropy. Bridgespan was born in the 21st century, serving both nonprofits and philanthropists and foundations. And it was the combination of those two that we thought might be helpful to others. Let me begin by highlighting 3 or 4 headlines and some patterns that we deduced coming out of the work that aren't necessarily explicit in the book. Headline number 1, and we refer to these as, quote, terrible truths. Not because they're that terrible, just that they're reality. First of all philanthropy is personal. It almost sounds trite to say it, but you see this play out within families where the spouses have different ideas of what they're doing. We see it play out with multiple generations. We see this play out between staff and that are supporting foundations. Philanthropy is inherently a deeply personal endeavor. It's the voluntary act of giving one's money away, maybe giving somebody else's money away. It has a personal overlay. You see this, by the way, this other people's money phenomenon at foundations, where executives change and strategies change. Even though donor intent didn't change, the mission didn't change, the strategy itself for the overall foundation didn't change, but the program changes. And so you can't divorce philanthropy from the people who are in fact doing the philanthropy. Now this has all kinds of implications. One of them is that left of their own accord, a family, for example, over time, will try to serve everybody in the family's needs with their personal philanthropy, which is fine. No problem there. You see foundations, family foundations say, okay, every child gets 25% of the pot, or whatever it happens to be. All fine. However, if people want to deliver the most results, however they define that with their money, then over time, by the time you get to 3 generations, 4 generations, dozens of participants, it tends to dilute effort. We call that peanut butter philanthropy. There's a pattern that's pretty clear for initiatives, philanthropic initiatives that generate results, and this is probably true in life, is fewer, bigger, longer. You know, you might pick one organization, you might pick one cause, you might pick 2 or 3, but doing fewer things over longer periods of time in bigger ways tends to generate more impact, probably because you get smarter at it. Think about, you know, I'm not an athlete, but think about playing 1 or 2 sports versus 8 or 10. So this notion that all philanthropy is personal has an important corollary, and that is what you want to do with your philanthropy, the results you want to achieve are personal. And this is where the book gets kind of interesting, because this book is not for everybody at all times. One of the most interesting and I think useful telling emails I received, we had a lot of people read the book, dozens and dozens and dozens in various forms. This fellow wrote me back and said, whoever wrote this knows nothing about philanthropy, has no experience, has never involved giving money away. Now, Joel Fleishman actually was president of Atlantic Philanthropies, which is a big part of that endeavor for many years. And this fellow went on to say, the only ambition of my philanthropy is to please my children. I am trying to help them feel good about themselves. I'm trying to teach them about life. It has nothing to do with results. It has nothing to do with these hard questions. It just has to do with my kids. Thank you very much. Well, that was kind of interesting. I got another one in a session, and we don't, Bridgespan doesn't really get involved with personal family situations in their philanthropy, only as favors to friends. This was a billionaire, or I should say an individual setting up a $1 billion foundation, who over a lengthy dinner with his wife, his kids, and their lawyers, where they were trying to develop the mission of the foundation, he said, with almost tearfully, he said, I simply want to bring my family together. That's all. I'd like to do no harm in the process, but I want to bring my family together. The kids were all like this. It did not look like the pathway to family happiness, but who knows? There are lots of different choices people make in philanthropy and lots of different consequences they have in mind. To the extent someone hopes to have a social outcome attached directly or indirectly to their philanthropy, it's not easy. So we say results are a choice, and those results come with a set of implications about what one might have to do to actually achieve those results. I should say there's another pattern related to all philanthropy is personal, and that's that, believe it or not, it's not just about the money. We had hundreds of illustrations Joel and I did that we ended up using, some of for the book, and kind of putting them in where places we thought they would make the most sense. There was a consistent pattern is that philanthropists that have impact on a specific initiative tend to be involved in that initiative with their time and influence. It's not just about writing checks. Now, the time may be very limited. It may be somebody that writes a huge check for a company, a nonprofit where they sit on the board of. It might be an alumnus of an institution that really cares about the institution and leaves that institution in their estate. So it doesn't mean they have to be spending 40 hours a week. What it does mean is being personally involved in the decision making and the thinking about using one's money seems to be important. Second terrible truth, and this one with a business background is particularly shocking, and it took me years to understand this, and I'm sure I still don't fully understand it, and that is in philanthropy, excellence is self-imposed. I never understood how easy business was until I entered this social sector stuff. In business, if you're running a restaurant, if we're all bought a restaurant together and we put stuff on the menu that isn't very good, guess what? We'll know that very quickly. Customers will not buy what we sell. If the Gap puts a purple checkered shirt that sells like crazy, they're going to stock more of those SKUs, right? Right. They get feedback, market signals every day from customers. If competitors are acting in a way that's gaining share, that's a market signal. If your owners are selling stock or buying it, those are market signals. Business is in some sense trial and error. You do not have to get it right up front. Bain's a strategy consulting firm. Strategy is a starting point, not an ending point. It just kind of gets you going. Think Lewis and Clark. We just got going, and from there on in, we're going to learn as we go along. Social sector strategy is called theory of change. It's a theory because you don't know actually what's going to work. Isn't that interesting? So this notion that excellence is self-imposed means you as a donor, or later on I'll mention NGOs, the nonprofits they support, you have to set the bar. And that's hard. You can set the bar very low. Like my friend who sent the email, I just want my kids to be happy, and I'm not sure, well, maybe that was a high bar, I'm not sure. But either way, you can set the bar wherever you want to set it. You're not going to go out of business. Think about the concept of foundations, for example, established in perpetuity. We're not established in perpetuity. Nobody in this room. No business is established in perpetuity. Governments aren't even established in perpetuity. What a concept. So this notion of excellence being self-imposed permeates social sector participation. If you want results, you have to work to achieve them. That doesn't mean 80 hours a week. You have to be thoughtful about it and periodically rigorous. Because philanthropy is personal, because results are a choice, because excellence is self-imposed, we structured the book around questions. I suppose if we were smarter, we could have figured out the one-size-fits-all answer. We could not figure that out. Philanthropy is too individualized, too localized to do that. We did, however, align ourselves with Einstein, who said questions are more important than answers. Because as near as we could see, the people who were achieving whatever it was, the results they wanted to achieve with their philanthropy, were confronting some tough questions. And so the book has 6 chapters, 6 questions. Questions overlap a little bit. They're interdependent. They aren't all relevant. Someone who is leaving their entire estate to one organization doesn't have to answer a lot of those questions. Somebody who's giving away $5 could care less about those questions. Although I did have someone tell me in an interview recently, said, listen, my $5,000 is worth more than $1 million to Bill Gates. I'm going to wrestle with those questions, at least some of them. So the questions aren't all relevant. They aren't all relevant in every giving situation, but they are the kinds of questions that if someone is placing a significant bet, time and or money, with the hope of achieving certain results, somebody has to address. Questions are, what are my values and beliefs, which get anchored in what you care about. Interesting footnote, I had a call from a hedge fund executive last week, and they generally have money, not always, but right now they generally have money. And this fella, wanted to talk, and I don't do sort of telephonic philanthropic advising. It's just, he said, listen, I want to give away $15 to $20 million a year for my hedge fund. That's nice. I'm listening, he's on speaker, I'm doing email, that's nice. And I said, tell me about, he's read the book. He said, but question number one I've got nailed, which is my values and beliefs. I want to get right to question number two, what's success and how will it be achieved? So tell me about your answer to question number one. So, well, listen, I want to focus on people less well off than me. Okay, so the 95 people that are in your level, we won't worry about, but everybody else will worry about. It turns out he needs to do a little bit more before he's going to have much in the way of productive philanthropy. But what are my values and beliefs is the first question, getting anchored in something. What's success? What's an A? What's an A? I serve on the board of the Nature Conservancy. An A might be, bequeathing my estate to the Nature Conservancy someday. Who knows? Because I care about and respect that organization. What is an A? And how's it going to be achieved? What am I accountable for? Sometimes what I'm accountable for is writing a check. Other times what I'm accountable for is developing a strategy and working with NGOs. Those three are sort of strategic questions. The next three questions, the back half of the book, are about getting the job done. One of the things I learned in business, which seems to be every bit as true in the social sector, is strategy may be 10% of the answer and execution is 90. Execution is where things fall short. It's the difference between the playbook and the players. We could swap playbooks all day between professional teams. The great teams would still be great teams with somebody else's playbook. So this question of execution is huge. In fact, I'm thinking about doing a little piece on this because everybody talks about multipliers in philanthropy. We're going to put in $1 and get $10 of impact or $100 of impact. And they call a lot of different words, big words to associate with that. Well, guess what? The multiplier can be a fraction. You can put in $1 and get out a dime. There's a multiplier. And when I see the dollar to dime, which by the way is way more common than the $1 to $2, is the dollar to dime. The dollar to dime is usually not so much about the quote strategy or general ideas as it is about the execution. 3 questions on execution. I am going to wrap up before he kicks me. What will it take to get the job done? These are kind of apply to business too. How do I work with grantees, in this case partners, and am I getting better? The execution questions are really hard. And the 2, what does it take to get the job done, and how do I work with grantees, are particularly profound for foundations and philanthropists, where most of the time their results are the consequence of other people's performance, other organizations' performance. This has been called the dance of deception between the nonprofit organizations and those who fund them. We Bridgespan, 2/3 of the work we do is on the nonprofit side, 1/3 on the donor side. We are a nonprofit. We raise funds for knowledge projects. We see this same dynamic. When you have a huge power imbalance, right? He who has the gold has the answer. And so you see this distortion, this lost opportunity between donors who often want to impose their answers on nonprofits who actually sometimes have a better answer and more experience. You see nonprofits that don't want to build the capacity or don't know how to build the capacity inside the organization, and donors who are happy that that's not happening because they don't want to fund that capacity anyhow because it's quote unquote overhead. So this connection between the two is fraught with problems. And I don't think there's a foundation in this country that we've encountered yet where if you pull behind the curtain and really see how productive the relationship and effective the relationship between the donor and the nonprofit is, where it couldn't improve 10%. And by the way, it's not just the donor's fault. This takes two organizations. It's just complicated. It would be as if back at Bain & Company, we had to subcontract everything we did through a third party. And we couldn't control. Yogi Berra said, when you give it away, you don't have it anymore. That is true of philanthropy. You're not buying an ownership stake. The money just left. Now what happens is the people you gave it to want more. They want more. And so they're going to tell you what you want to hear and so forth. Anyhow, the last question in the book seems to be the most important and the one where I said, why did you write the book? This is why we wrote the book. The last question is, am I getting better? And the reason we wrote the book was to help individuals confront the question of how they could get just a little bit better at achieving whatever results they're trying to achieve with their philanthropy, right? To get better, you first have to ask, what am I trying to do in the first place? You might have to acknowledge your mortality. You might have to confront a bunch of other questions about, are you going to give money away? If so, how, where, when, and so forth. Hard, painful questions that people love to ignore. Although last week I was telling this gang earlier, a 37-year-old billionaire whom you would know, say, I'm 37 years old, I'm behind in my philanthropy. Now that's kind of neat. He said, I want to give everything away during my lifetime. I was going to put him in touch with the hedge fund guy and they can work it out. But anyway, so we wrote Give Smart to be useful to folks, kind of a self-help tool. We created a website around that. It's been out about 5 weeks, and it's been interesting because and I'll wrap up here, the notion of the right questions asked by personal philanthropists or their families seems to have touched a little bit of a nerve. And I suspect that people confronting those questions, and I think this has been true historically, if you went back to what Joel would say, it's individuals, families confronting those questions that has driven an awful lot of the innovation that we've seen in the philanthropic space. I'm quiet there. Thank you.
Thank you. Christy.
Great. Hi there. Thanks for having me today. Just wanted to say thanks. I'm really honored to be part of this panel with these impressive folks up here. And sorry, I need to pull this closer. Yeah. Okay.
Closer.
And to have a chance to comment on what I think is a really thoughtful and important book. So I wanted to share two things, both some of the points that I really like the most about the book and also make some critiques, which I hope to offer in the spirit of friendly amendments.
Closer. Sorry, closer still.
Sure. Okay. So I just want to echo and underline a few points initially and say fundamentally I agree with the core assumptions that the book is based on about philanthropy being personal and values-driven, that results are a choice, that excellence is self-imposed. There are a lot of things about the structure of the philanthropy sector that really work against high performance, actually, or make it something that you have to choose to strive for. And I think they've done a wonderful job of kind of laying out what those challenges are. Secondly, I want to just point out how important clearly defined outcome goals are. It seems like the most basic point to make, but having been in and among big funders for the last 8 years, it's amazing to me how rare it is to have a clearly defined outcome goal, even at the highest levels of philanthropy today. And I think you really can't get very far if you don't know yourself clearly what you're aiming for, and you certainly can't communicate that to a field so that people would be able to raise their own ideas and innovations that might help address that problem. So when I think about clarity and outcome goals in particular, I think it's important to think about measurable goals, and just want to underline the point that they've made. And then lastly, I wanted to emphasize the importance of humility in the approach to grant making and to relationships with grantees. And they made a number of points along these lines in the book. The idea of actual true listening and partnering approaches with grantees, and the pursuit of continuous improvement. My experience is that the power imbalance is very real. It is extremely difficult to get honest feedback. Oftentimes that only comes over time and over repeated opportunities for grantees to share things. And I think that our decision-making suffers within foundations if we don't have that honest feedback and information flow. So it does come down to the approach of grant makers at some point, creating that environment and opportunity for information flow. And then I want to raise a couple points where my perspective diverges a bit from the authors. Again, I think it's a matter of detail rather than disagreement. But I'll just raise the points early on about getting clear, which is about defining success, and about getting real, deciding how success can be achieved. In my mind, those are about the details of a foundation's strategy for achieving impact. And I'm going to raise one general critique, not just of this book, but of the state of practice in strategic philanthropy today. I co-authored an article with a colleague of mine, Malcolm Coppell, just recently in the Stanford Social Innovation Review called Letting Go. And so these kinds of ideas are represented there for anybody who's interested in reading more. My overall concern is that strategic philanthropy today often leads foundations into micromanaging how a problem is solved. And this isn't a problem if the challenge or the problem you're trying to address is highly technical, one where there's a clearly understood solution, it's been proven to work, it's been proven to transfer, and really it's just a matter of execution. Then I think it can be quite effective to have kind of a rigidly defined strategy and just go for it, just manage towards that outcome. But much more often than not, the problems that philanthropy is focused on are these complex social problems. Some people call them adaptive problems. And in these kinds of problems, there are no clear, proven, kind of guaranteed solutions. And I think in dealing with these types of problems, foundations today often, in the pursuit of high impact, make two types of mistakes as they design their strategies. One is focusing narrowly on one pathway to the goal. We often do that in the spirit of focus, the idea that that will lead to higher impact if we can focus, and often that leads us to choose just one pathway as a way. That's true focus. And the second thing we often do is design solutions ourselves within foundations. And in my opinion, both of these behaviors undermine impact ultimately. And I'll say a little bit more about that. But I just want to connect this to the book that while I don't see, they didn't explicitly take on the details of a foundation strategy in this way, but I just wanted to kind of warn that it could be read as encouraging funders to do this kind of micromanagement, to kind of decide exactly how to solve the problem that they're concerned with, and then pick grantees that align with their chosen theory of change. And just to share a few details about why I think this type of kind of controlling approach to solving problems is not likely to succeed. Based on my own grant-making experience and based on a look across many sectors today at high-performing organizations, I think we see time and time again that the more complex and dynamic a problem is, the more unpredictable it is, the more difficult it becomes to fix with a centrally planned, rigidly defined solution. In fact, iterating and kind of openness to a handful of ideas is one of the only ways we tend to manage our ways through those kinds of challenges. So there are 4 specific problems I see with this approach of funders designing solutions and narrowly focusing. One is that it's this execution problem that Tom mentioned, which I tend to call implementation. But basically, when funders design the solutions themselves, the theory of change about how to get to their goals, this leads to weak implementation. There's just no two ways about it. It's a principal agent problem for those of you who kind of are economics folks. You know, ultimately, the folks who are tasked with execution or with implementation don't share the same kind of passion or vision for that solution as they would if they had designed it themselves. And we have a nice example we provide in the article, but I can just say to you across the board that in my time at Hewlett, we do an annual contest on grants that have been kind of less successful than we hoped, and we talk through why they were less successful. And this is this problem, the principal agent problem of a foundation designed solution that is then poorly executed by a grantee, is second only in failures to cases where an organization's executive director just leaves and the organization kind of falls apart. So I think it's also a very common problem. But I think this is not to be ignored. The idea that you can conceive of a way of solving a problem, then hand it off to someone, creates a really difficult implementation challenge. Second, focusing on one pathway to the goal is a very fragile strategy when you're investing in a complex environment. This is kind of akin to all eggs in one basket. And I think folks in financial investing have learned a long time ago, I think because they have better feedback loops, that diversification is a much better approach when you're dealing with an unpredictable environment. The only exception I would raise is the cases where one solution has been clearly proven to be head and shoulders more effective than any others and to be replicable and kind of transferable to other environments, which I would argue is not very common. Third, exerting too much control causes foundations to ignore high-performing nonprofit organizations and leaders. So when a foundation decides how it thinks a problem should be solved, that essentially means that all other ways of solving that problem become off strategy or unaligned with the foundation strategy. So you can have a situation, which is actually very common, where there are many, many high-performing organizations that are actually getting to the goal that you've chosen as a funder, but it doesn't align with your strategy, so they're not going to be eligible for funding. And one example I'll give here, the U.S. Department of Education recently ran an I3 competition that was investing in innovation competition, which was entirely designed around evidence of impact. So they had a very significant review process. Things were transparent. They tiered applications based on the level of scientific evidence that they had. And the winners, there were 19 organizations that won in the top 2 levels of that competition, which were the 2 that required the most rigorous scientific evidence. So I went and contacted each of those 19 organizations and said, just out of curiosity, these were all education organizations, I said, just out of curiosity, how many of these top 50 largest education funders have funded you in the year prior to you winning the I3 competition? Lots of them, by the way, lots of the funders hopped on board after they won because it was a matching agreement. So there was a big incentive for funders to jump in. What we found was that on average, those organizations had only 3 grants open from the 50 largest funders. And I'll say, those numbers even are dramatically pulled by just a couple of those winners who had upwards of 15 grants in place. So there were a number of winners who had 0 or only 1 grant from the top 50 largest education funders. And these are organizations with the highest impact, with the highest record, highest scientific evidence of impact. So it's just one example of the fact that I think many of us in the foundation world ignore high performance if it doesn't fit with the strategy that we have identified for ourselves. And then lastly, exerting too much control can cause foundations to ignore innovations. So by definition, innovations, particularly breakthrough innovations, are things that no one has anticipated before. And so a foundation that's designing a strategy or a theory of change about how to solve a social problem can't anticipate things that might be developed in the future. And again, that makes many of the most interesting innovations essentially off strategy and unfundable. I have probably just a few, I need to do a time check. A few more minutes? Okay. So we also looked at high-performing organizations in other sectors to see how did those organizations stay on the top of their field: business, government, healthcare, education. And what we found, or what we postulate, is that many of these are using a tight on goals, loose on means approach to achieving their goals. So they're empowering ground-level workers to develop new products and solutions. They're even co-creating those products and services with consumers and end users. And we suggest that if funders want higher impact, they should also consider this tight on goals, loose on means approach. That would be my suggestion about what good strategic philanthropy looks like, the details of a strategy. And I just want to emphasize that doesn't mean that foundations give away all control. In these kinds of high-performing organizations, you see the leadership setting clear goals, establishing clear accountability mechanisms, creating continuous information flows, and most importantly, providing flexibility for folks throughout their organizations to innovate, to experiment, to try different things, to iterate and get better over time. So we kind of point the way to 3 different approaches to philanthropy that we see as tight, loose models. And I'll just mention them quickly and then tie back to the book here. One is providing general support for proven effective leaders and organizations in the field to grow, improve, and scale up for impact. Second is supporting community design solutions that harness the distributed wisdom in the field rather than just being designed kind of in a vacuum at a foundation office. And lastly, fostering innovation to really accelerate the pace of change. Because if we don't harness those innovations, we're going to be stuck in a very incremental pace of progress, which is what I would argue we're in right now and have been for many years. We've got to find ways to get to those breakthroughs. And so what was interesting to me in reading the book is that actually the authors do highlight many success stories from funders who I would say are using this tight, loose approach. What's interesting is they're also interleaved with funders who do not use a tight, loose approach. So I just wanted to kind of point this out and raise it for discussion. So some of the funders who kind of use this, particularly the general support for high-performing organizations, there were a number of examples in the book: Fisher, Sandler, Draper Richards, Edna McConnell Clark, Olin, and those are just a few. I also saw success stories described in the book where funders had specific, where I would say they had a version of diversification in the way they invested, which I also think is a positive approach. These are funders who had a specific solution in mind, but they naturally evolved their investment over time from one type of solution to another as they learned what was getting the most traction over time. There was an environmental conservation funder described there, and also the funder of NPower. And I think this is, again, an important model, the ability to innovate and evolve what solutions you're interested in over time. And it basically reflects the fact that it's hard to pick the right solution from the get-go. That successful funders are those who listen, learn, and adjust over time. I like to kind of compare it to a horse race, that if you just lock in on a solution from the get-go, you're essentially picking that winning horse before the race has been run and not allowing those other competitors to even give it a try. So overall, and then I'm just going to point out one example that didn't work for me, and look forward to discussion on it. This was about some examples around funders who were a little more rigid in terms of how they decided to achieve their goals. And the one I'll describe here is the Barbara Lee Family Foundation. So there, the goal they chose was to try to get more women elected to office, and particularly they were measuring elected, people. They were measuring numbers of women who were elected, and the theory of change, or the kind of solution they chose, was to focus specifically on creating and distributing guidebooks for female candidates for elected office. And that, I don't know, all I know is what I've read in the book. So there could be many other things that happened in that case, but from the description, I have a hard time believing that guidebooks for female candidates is the only or best way to help more women get elected to office. So I would suggest in this, and yet they were lauded for being highly focused. And I would say this is an example of a case where the high focus it's only a good thing if you know that you've found the one right solution, the best solution. And this is a case where I would say there's quite a bit of uncertainty about whether guidebooks are in fact the best way to help women get elected to office, or whether there might be other kinds of strategies that might be equally or even more effective in helping them get elected. So overall, I just wanted to kind of summarize to say I think the book really accurately reflects the field of strategic philanthropy today. I think it's critical that it focus attention on these important ideas around the values and clear outcomes that need to guide grant making. We really, that's not a given today, and particularly important as all these new billionaires are taking the Billionaire's Pledge from Gates and Buffett and beginning to think about designing new foundations. So I'm glad, I really like the approach of multiple questions, kind of helping people think through what their interests are. But I would like to see more nuance in the discussion of foundation strategies, both about the dangers of exerting too much control over how a problem is solved, and rigidly determining funding based on a pet solution, and also about the enormous potential for impact that can be realized by supporting highly effective nonprofits that are already proven on the ground, by harnessing distributive wisdom and distributed leadership in communities, and by fostering innovation. Thanks.
Thank you. Jeff?
All right. Thank you. Thank you, William, for having me here today. Although I should be patting myself on the back for making that 3,000-mile trip across the country.
Indeed.
But it's certainly worth it, especially to read what is truly a wonderful book. And I do encourage you to buy it and to read it. Not just philanthropists, but people who are in the business of seeking grants as well. It's a very intelligent book on that score. And at $15, you just can't beat the price here today. So. The natural state of philanthropy, as characterized by Tom Tierney and Joel Fleishman in their important book, Give Smart, is a dismal place. Its most prominent feature is underperformance. Ignorance and arrogance are its cardinal sins. In the natural state of philanthropy, decision-making is often clouded by ambiguity and uncertainty. And, quote, insidious traps lie in wait at every turn, undermining good intentions and impeding results. Here, nonprofit leaders are inspirational men and women who charm donors with their visionary ideas, but they fall short in critical management activities and discipline. Philanthropists are well-intentioned for the most part, but often they are easily misled, arrogant, and essentially unaccountable to no one but themselves. In the absence of market dynamics, Tierney and Fleishman write, the natural state of philanthropy is a hapless cross between the Galapagos Islands and the mythical Lake Wobegon. There is a blissful absence of predators, and all of the children are above average. In short, grant-making in the natural state of philanthropy is unaccountable, undisciplined, and ineffectual. For Tierney and Fleishman, however, the natural state of philanthropy is not an exotic locus or a mythical Minnesotan village populated by well-intentioned Scandinavians. It is the charitable sector, past and present. The lowly natural state of philanthropy is no place for the new class of results-minded philanthropic CEOs, consultants, and professionals. GiveSmart posits 6 wise questions aimed at aiding donors, nonprofit leaders, and foundation executives in contracting out of the natural state of philanthropy. These questions belong to that category of inquiry that have no simple answers, and therefore are worth asking more than once, turning them over in one's mind, discussing them, coming back to them from time to time, seeing them anew years hence with fresh eyes. Part therapeutic self-examination and part business management seminar, the 6 questions, if they are pursued diligently and honestly, initiate a process that would assist nearly any philanthropist who is serious about achieving what the authors describe in the language of muscular philanthropy as high-impact results. In posing these questions, Tierney and Fleishman will hopefully set more than a few donors on a path to more effective giving. Through anecdote, metaphor, and example, the authors also give their readers an aerial view of the land of high-impact results, a world apart from the natural state of philanthropy. If all of the inhabitants of the natural state of philanthropy are, by analogy to Lake Wobegon, good-looking and above average, then the men and women of the land of high-impact results are totally hot and absolutely brilliant. Having plumbed the depths of his values, beliefs, and passions, the results-oriented donor in the land of high-impact results is a visionary leader. He or she stands astride the nonprofit world, swelling with disciplined management experience, girded with a well-honed theory of change, a team of experts and professionals at the ready. Having subdued the business world in his first 40 years, the results-oriented philanthropist stands soberly, prepared to solve the world's most intractable problems that have heretofore resisted the feeble efforts of governments, international aid organizations, and lowly NGOs. For unlike the natural state of philanthropy, the land of high-impact results is about accountability and outcomes. Void of market mechanisms and signals that enforce accountability and discipline, the high-impact philanthropist would be at sea in the natural state of philanthropy, but for his willingness to demand excellence from himself. Self-imposed accountability, the authors allow, is an unnatural act. But for the results-oriented philanthropist in the land of high-impact results, resolve, perseverance, and the disciplined pursuit of high performance simply come with the territory. Philanthropy always comes, as the authors point out, with a heavy dose of me. The land of high-impact results is not about modesty. After all, the authors confidently assert, how you approach your philanthropy offers the most unfiltered manifestation of who you are as a human being. In the land of high-impact results, the ego of the donor becomes the wellspring of philanthropic innovation, discipline, and ultimately results. Excellence is self-imposed. But the results-oriented philanthropist can't go it alone, even in the land of high-impact philanthropy. Unlike the natural state of philanthropy, here philanthropists and nonprofit professionals mutually understand the other's shortcomings and, through studious self-examination, common exploration, and a shared definition of success work beyond them. Tasks that often stress the relationship between nonprofits and donors in the natural state of philanthropy, like assembling facts about programs and finances, evolve into shared dialogues of developing mutually committed and trusting relationships. Effective due diligence, the authors suggest, is a process of mutual discovery. Like all great journeys, however, the path that leads beyond the natural state of philanthropy to the land of high impact results is narrow and not for the feeble or uninitiated. Effective philanthropists must be disciplined and tough-minded about how they allocate their scarce resources, the authors warn. Although the geography and signposts of Give Smart are familiar to many nonprofit professionals, consultants, and social sector academics, the journey to the land of high impact results is a mysterious quest to the bulk of America's 70,000 private, small, and family foundations, as it is to its legions of high net worth donors, many of whom are quite satisfied with their giving. Indeed, the chasm that separates the rarefied land of high impact philanthropy and the natural state of philanthropy appear so formidable. One wonders if there are important features that our cartographers have overlooked, undervalued, or overstated when they map the features of these two great lands. Mapping, after all, is truly a matter of perspective. If the natural state of philanthropy is, as so many seem to agree, underperformance, one might take issue with the standard by which it is measured. In the wake of the housing bubble, the collapse of the stock market, and unprecedented bailout of financial institutions by taxpayers, it seems reasonable to ask whether business sector performance measures and management protocols provide the surest yardstick for taking stock of the philanthropic sector or even of individual giving. Do we undervalue the performance of the nonprofit sector because we measure it by private sector standards, asking of it what we would never expect of the marketplace? The often unstated fear of many nonprofit leaders who labor in the underperforming natural state of philanthropy and who are carried along in the tide of high impact results as a matter of professional necessity is that there are jobs that need doing, populations that need serving, and ideas that need advancing that, at the end of the day, fall outside the calculus of the results-minded philanthropist. Are there things worth doing that cannot be counted? Programs worth funding that cannot be scaled? Organizations worth supporting that chronically underperform? That philanthropy can be at ease with itself in an underperforming environment, doing things that the marketplace undervalues, has been understood by many as one of its greatest strengths.
Good, excellent, thank you. Just checking to make sure that's great. Let me, and for a change, the folks that I invited to comment on the main topic actually delivered precisely the opinions that I was hoping for, which is a rare occurrence. So let me begin, if I may, and I just want to stir things up for a second, and then we'll go to the audience. But Christy, as you know, in our invitation, we actually linked to your article, Letting Go, which I think is a terrific piece, and it got to the first question that just, if I could put it to you and Tom for just a second. Tom, I would, in a way, I would describe your book as, in a phrase, as urging philanthropists to take charge. Number one, you've really got to commit yourself thoroughly to this process. And in that process of sort of committing yourself, heart and soul, to a philanthropic enterprise, don't you sort of play into the danger that Christy points to, which is, it's hard once you've sort of gotten one of these high energy individuals going in a certain direction. It's hard for them to say, okay, I have now really, shaped my giving, and now I'm going to recognize all the precautions that Christy points to, i.e., we really do have to find a way to let grantees, carry out the design that's best for them, as opposed to, is there a way we can sort of, is there a point where we need to apply the brakes to the taking charge model, or?
Let's see, this is so complicated to generalize, so I
Right.
guess the first thing I would say is maybe slightly alter your premise, which
Change
is,
it as you please. I'm the guy
which
with the
is,
purple shirt, so.
We're encouraging philanthropists or potential philanthropists to confront questions that may or may not lead to them taking charge. It may lead to them bequesting all of their assets upon death to their alma mater. It may mean that. It does not mean setting up a foundation. It does not mean quitting your day job and spending 60 hours a week telling nonprofits what to do. It simply is, what are you going to do with the money you intend to give away? And thinking about that a little sooner rather than a little later. An organization wants me to attend a live donors forum, and I'm waiting for the dead donors forum. I think that would be a really interesting group to talk to. What's it like over there? Anyhow, so that's, I think, confronting the questions, because what we see are people either ignoring the questions or not actually thinking about them rigorously enough, and therefore wasting money, if you want to call it that. On the issue that Christy raised, the back half of the book is, to some extent, consistent with your piece, which is there is dramatic yield loss. It's the multiplier being a fraction between the donor and the donor organization, and we come at that in a couple of different ways. But one way is to flag what I think is highly consistent with your article, which I really like, is strategic disruption. It's very common to see donors who actually don't know very much thinking they know a lot.
Right.
There's something about being successful and having money that causes that particular attitude to emerge. And so we've seen this, and my emphasis earlier on the phrase theory of change is meant to also relate to this strategy as dynamic. Because you don't have market, you just have to learn. And it's not about having 1,000 PowerPoint slides. I couldn't agree more. And most of the learning is not going on at the grant level. It's going on with the NGO or whatever organization is actually on the front lines doing it. And so this relationship is fraught with problems. And we were talking earlier, most nonprofits would say, if you gave them truth serum, I would love to have your money, but please don't give me any time. Unless the time is related to raising more money for me. And please do not tell me what my strategy is. The complication is there needs to be a theory of change. And if the NGO does not have one, or has one that is half-baked, somebody's going to impose. So I think these things, I can hold both these truths, that in some cases there are donors that are actually pretty thoughtful and can add value strategically. In other cases, there aren't. In some cases, the NGOs are not that thoughtful strategically, or maybe phenomenally thoughtful strategically. Hard to generalize.
Gotcha. Christy, speaking of theory of change, someone you know well actually wrote a book about this whole concept. And what struck me about your article is the degree to which, let's say, you qualify some of the observations in that book, or it's another take on this whole notion of strategy of the strategy of change. As I read the article, Tom's notion that we need to impose strategies or theories of change, on nonprofits is, Tom's philanthropist is likely to want to do that more often than not, I suspect. And you suggest, I think, in your article that one needs to be a bit more flexible on that score. Am I getting that wrong, or can you? And in the course of responding to my rambling question, maybe you can also respond to Tom's observation.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. I think, Tom, there are a huge number of things in your book that are very consistent with the points that I'm trying to make about the dangers in how foundations design their strategies. And so I want to be clear on a couple things. One, I'm not anti-theory of change. I think for impact, somebody needs a very strong strategy and theory of change. I just propose that that be the group that's implementing the work. In other words, the organizations on the ground who are the grantees. If they don't know what their theory of change is, I don't think we should be funding them. I don't think it's an effective solution for the donor to step up and propose a theory of change if the organization doesn't have one. A second solution, so that's one piece. I think we need to empower the grantees to have their own theories of change and then test those rigorously. Approach grant making a little bit more like a scientific mindset of experimenting and checking to see what works and what doesn't, rather than as an advocate where the funder just decides on one theory of change and puts on blinders to any others that may work. The second thing that I see as an alternative approach is for donors who have a lot of know-how and management ability and time to give, I think it is a really different and promising model to just create what you would call an operating foundation. So that means you don't do so much giving away of grants. Instead, you just run projects yourselves. And there are downsides. I mean, so if every funder in the world became an operating foundation, there wouldn't be any money for most of the NGOs that are out there today. So there are downsides. But one thing it does solve is this issue of a donor who really has a clear vision of how to solve a problem. And I think the safest, if you're using the do no harm idea, the safest way to implement that kind of a clear vision is to just go out and do it yourself as a funder, be an operating foundation. So those are a couple thoughts. And one other point I wanted to raise is just the idea of inquiry-based philanthropy, which is raised in the book. I very much agree with that, and I think these kinds of questions that they lay out for someone who's thinking about beginning a foundation also should continue throughout the process of investing. So it strikes me as arbitrary to choose some moment when you stop experimenting and you begin to lock down on exactly how to solve a problem, that these are tricky issues. And really, I think it would be interesting for a foundation to be very clear about a goal, a measurable outcome goal, but then approach their philanthropy with a question in mind. How do we best get to this goal? And never expect to lock down on a strategy, because you would imagine that there are always ways of getting to the goal more and more effectively over time. And your interest or your guiding strategy is to support that innovation and iteration towards the goal.
Gotcha. Now, Jeff, your characterization of the natural state of philanthropy versus, I'm sorry, did you want to say something further to that?
It's a footnote, but maybe we'll come back to it.
Yeah, okay, good, all right. Jeff's concept of the natural state of philanthropy versus high impact results philanthropy, or high impact philanthropy. I agree with you, and it struck me as well that Tom and Joel's book, more than most books on philanthropy, and it really is it's worth reading it just for this element alone, really is a description of the incredible number of ways, right, philanthropy can get it wrong. All the things, all the tugs, all the temptations, all the forces that conspire to make philanthropy less effective than it could be, all the way from, the beginning point, i.e., what are you going to do with the family? How is our family going to, how is our philanthropy going to make our family better? Which is, of course, always a prescription for problems. All the way down to, what was it, the culture of lying? What did you call it? I can't remember. The dance of deception. The dance of deception. At the other end of the process, after you've made the grant, everyone, your own program officers and certainly the nonprofits, everybody has an interest in saying it was a terrific grant, and everything was wonderful, and it all turned out terrifically. I think that's. Jeff, do you dispute that that's sort of the natural state of philanthropy? I mean, I thought the book was really quite strong on that front, and that it really did get to I mean, would you say things are better in philanthropy than that, or that there's a natural state of philanthropy that makes it?
Well, I took that natural state of philanthropy, the natural state of philanthropy is underperformance from your introduction. Right? That's,
Yeah.
So and no, look, I don't dispute. In fact, the book really is a wonderful catalog, like you say, of all of the things that can go wrong and that in fact do go wrong. And it's even more than that. It's a discussion of what appear to be the structural forces that are in place that undermine and erode effective philanthropy, right? And so, like the question of accountability, right? To whom is the philanthropist accountable? This is a problem, and it's wrestled with intelligently in the book. The bigger question that I have, though, one of the things that I kept thinking about in this, as I was reading this, is what are we talking about here? Are we in terms of the philanthropic marketplace? What are we talking? What portion of it are we talking about? So we're talking about maybe $315 billion a year in annual giving, give or take, right? And what do foundations? Because we really are talking about foundations. It's not specifically written for foundation executives or for just foundation donors who are operating in a foundation model. But then we're talking about just about 14% of it. So we're really not talking here about philanthropy in general. We're talking about a pretty narrow segment of the philanthropic marketplace. And so the question I have in the book, and the book points at this. That's why I say it's a tough book to almost put your finger on because it does many things and some of them very well. It's the issue of where is accountability? Where is it? How do you find it? And the one thing that I found odd about the book is that it seems to me that knowing that all of these things that we say about family foundations and about the vanity of the donor and all these problems, how could it possibly be that the locus of responsibility then lies with the donor soul, right? And how will that overcome in this regimen, all of the problems that's created in the first place? In other words, the solution to the problem is indulging the problem even more, right? Having the donor mine his passions and values, and that this becomes a source, and accountability really becomes the problem of the donor. Now, there's not that there's not truth to that. Because when we talk about donor intent, and it's not something that could be externally regulated. But it started me to thinking and wondering if there isn't if there aren't external accountability measures that don't obviously come from the marketplace or from regulation, but come from the sort of community of donors, the community of, in other words, the customs, habits, and traditions, the expectations, families, in which the donor operates. That we don't think about it in these terms, but if there isn't some type of way of thinking about sort of prudent checks on giving that come not from regulation or not strictly from the donor's own, is it really all dependent on whether a donor is going to be self-disciplined or not? I mean, is that the fate of that $100 million sitting there, is whether or not? So it's not that these abusive things, it's really where is the locus of accountability, and I found it implausible that maybe that it's solely with the donor.
But and I'll let you answer that in a second. But just to push him just to push Jeff a bit, and I think you're right. I think that the implicit message of the book, if we may discuss it with the author sitting in front of us, the implicit message of the book is that we need to face resolutely and courageously the fact, right, that there really aren't any plausible mechanisms of accountability other than the donor's own intent. And I think in a way, the virtue of the book is that it says, look, a lot of other books of advice will give you the rules of grant making and how you should do, and you know, what are the constraints and all this. But the fact of the matter is, Tom says, the fact of the matter is it's really entirely finally up to the donor, you know, whether or not this grant making is whether it multiplies, you know, you get $2 of results for $1 of investment or 10 cents of results for $1 of investment. It's almost entirely up to the donor. Isn't there something bracing about that? Doesn't the donor now isn't there something really sort of inspiriting about that for the donor to realize, gosh, you know, I really do have to face up to this responsibility myself. There really aren't, you know, I'm really not going to get guidance from, you know, my financial investors, or there aren't really rules of the road that I can rely on for it. No?
Yeah, no, and I actually really like that part of the book, and it points, but doesn't quite get to the point where I was hoping that it would get to, which is this is really a moral enterprise, and that the restrictions of the donor aren't just process restrictions that you have to go through to discover what your passions and values are, but that there's moral responsibility. And I think that there's a wonderful paragraph, I can't remember the page, it comes later in the book, about the problem in philanthropy of lying. And lying's back, it's a problem, right? I mean, it's lying it undermines the results-oriented philanthropist like it does everything else. And there seems to be structural reasons within philanthropy that make lying a particularly pernicious problem. And so, so there's a wonderful passage about that. And so I mean, I guess the direction that I would take it is really to articulate the moral side of philanthropy, and that this, independent of these external checks or marketplace forces, it is all the more incumbent upon individuals to act responsibly and to act morally. And I think that I wonder whether the toolkit of the modern day consultant has the language to articulate that to donors or to nonprofits. It seems that the book runs up against it, but then doesn't engage it satisfactorily, although, Tom, you may have a very different idea about it.
Now, Tom, would you like to get in on this discussion of your book, or shall we just keep on?
Clearly, we need another couple of books to cover these topics. Let's see. Let me try to describe who the book was written for, and what it was trying to do, what it is trying to do, because there's a clear pattern here, which is there are other possibilities. So I'll take what you said. The book is written for a segment within a segment. It is written for people who have money to give away, more than a few hundred or a few $1,000s. So that's written for those folks. That's a segment. Most of them, by the way, do not have foundations. They might have a foundation legal structure, but I guarantee you most people that are giving away hundreds of millions of dollars are not staffing that up with lots of folks. They are doing it themselves, through their donor advised fund, through their checking account, through all kinds of areas. It's written for those decision makers. It's written for the principals and the people who advise or work for those principals. That's who it's written for. It is, in that case, a segment within a segment. Within that, we are very careful, and maybe not careful enough, to focus on philanthropy, not philanthropist. So never there did we hold a philanthropist up as having all the answers, because it turns out it is almost always a portfolio. So we found even people with their own foundations have donor advised funds that they're doing other stuff with. And we could not find any philanthropist that walked on water who was in that second land that you described, because it doesn't work that way. We tried to pick illustrations of philanthropy that has a person, an active donor behind it, that seem to be working out pretty well. So then it's a segment within a segment, which is really what we're focused on. We're focused on the initiative level, very consciously not trying to elevate certain philanthropists, and certainly not going to that next level of the sector. So that's premise one. We're focused on decision makers where they are either giving away their own money, their family's money, or somebody is helping them do that. Tiny. Within that, initiatives where they really have some results in mind. Could be endowing the arts organizations where they serve on the board. Could be something way more complicated than that. Within that construct, we observe a pretty obvious principle, and it's voluntary. It's still striking to me that people give money away when you think about it. I mean, just literally, there it is. I mean, you know, people just give money away, and it's not just the rich. We give money away. It's really hard to get money, and we still give it away. People who earned it themselves, struggled for decades, give it away. It's a beautiful thing. It's a voluntary thing. And they're going to do it whatever personal, messy kind of way. They can confront the questions or not confront the questions. So we tried to recognize that inherently voluntary nature of this act. Say, for those people who are in certain situations, have money to give away, and within that context, in certain situations, are trying to achieve something specific with that money, think about asking these questions. Now, all that said, are there broader issues related to philanthropy writ large? Absolutely. Do people understand fully the moral imperative and the kind of operational imperative of doing this well? No. Most people that give away lots of money haven't done it before. They've been making it. And it's a really different activity. So the one thing we were trying to do with stories in the book is to describe it ain't easy. People think it's easy, and then they stumble. And they describe, or better yet, or worse yet, they stumble but don't know they stumble.
So I have one thought on, I think this question of how to create a stronger sense of accountability is a huge one.
Right.
And I really appreciate you for taking it on in the book. And I think we need to keep wrestling with it. I just want to say one thought, just an idea about how we might get there. I don't have a whole lot of hope in the kind of moral approach because I think we're all human. And this is just it's human nature that when you get into a position of giving away money and people begin to tell you that your ideas are great and you're really funny and actually you're much more beautiful than the last time they saw you, it goes to your head. It becomes very hard to continue remembering that there could be other ways of solving problems than the ones that you think are the best. And so I think an interesting way to try to solve this accountability problem would be to think about structures or mechanisms we could create that would open up philanthropy to a little more feedback. Because my sense is that accountability comes fundamentally from feedback. If you're not hearing honest feedback about your performance, there's no way you can be accountable for it. So one small step I think funders could take, whether they have a foundation or they're just doing this on their own, would be to think about radical transparency. So, you know, a number of schools and school districts, we've done this where we just simply say, publish your test scores. Sometimes they do it at the state level, different levels of kind of sunshine being shown on outcomes. And I think it would be very interesting to see funders do this as well, to say, you know, we're going to take everything from our grant reports that we get in annually, from our proposals that we decide to fund, from the proposals that we decide not to fund, from whatever details we can provide about our decision-making processes, and we're going to put those up for the world to see. And obviously, this would not be for for all people because you're going to invite a heck of a lot of feedback if you do that. But I think it would be one simple mechanism that could really get that information flowing and wouldn't require funders to take any action based on it, but simply would give them the opportunity to hear more and have a chance of being more accountable to different kinds of constituencies that are providing that feedback.
Shall we go to the audience? Are we ready for that?
Before I'd like to just
Yeah.
recognize, I think Hewlett has been a pathbreaker in talking about failure or situations that didn't work out exactly, and being transparent around that, because the pattern we see throughout the sector is isolated learning, little pockets of learning. And I understand the sort of do no harm, so a donor gives money to a nonprofit organization, the nonprofit organization, a disaster, nothing happens, it's poorly run, a bunch of that, but you're not allowed to talk about that because that will harm this underperforming, disastrous nonprofit organization. You say, well, so that means other people can give that organization money, and the cycle continues because nobody's allowed to talk about it. And so there's with the attempt not to hurt anyone, and the notion that all these organizations merit support of some kind, and that philosophy ends up hurting the kids. In this case, the beneficiaries you're trying to serve in the first place. So this notion of transparency and feedback loops and it's measurement as learning. It's just learning. How do we know what works? We don't know the big we, don't always know what works because we don't share what isn't working. And I'll one highlight from the book. We were asked by the publisher, we got about 2/3 of the way through, and we had dozens of these readers, and they were saying, we want to hear more failure stories. Okay, failure stories. So we had all the interviews, people wouldn't let us publish the failure stories. Most of the failure stories in there are discussed. It's so interesting. And why? Well, it's not fair to the other players involved. Other donors are still funding. Whoa, what? Why? Anyway, so, agree.
Just a couple of panels ago, we actually had a panel on a new book by Bob Geloff at Annie Casey Foundation. He has a book called Failures to Success, I believe it is. Does anyone? I think that's the title of it. But we'll link from this point in the transcript to that panel, because it's a terrific and they're very explicit about who messed up, and who else was involved, which the nonprofits are implicated in these failures. Good. Well, let's go to the audience. We do have a microphone, do we not? Yes. Who would like to ask a question? And I am supposed to remind you to speak directly and clearly into the microphone. You have to hold it very close to your mouth in order to be heard. And please identify yourself and your institution. So, questions. There must be some questions out there. Yes, please. Pat, right down front here.
Hi, a terrific panel.
Yeah. Pat Reed. Oh, we have two. Oh, good.
Thank you. I'm Pat Reed. I'm formerly Senior Vice President of Policy at Independent Sector, and now exploring a number of options with both donors and nonprofits, but this was a great panel. I was fascinated with your comments on the failure, the accountability of donors, and the failure to acknowledge the failures and to really talk openly, a place where I think donors could help boards be more effective in recognizing where there are problems. But I'm also fascinated, Christy, you talked about some very high-performing nonprofits who are not in the pipeline for major foundation grants. And I wondered if you might be willing to talk a little bit about where you see the problems there. Is it that the NGOs are not going to the foundations, or where are they getting blocked out of the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And let me just sort of reinforce it. We've had 15 years now of discussions about the centrality of metrics and how absolutely critical they are, and we have to fund just the people who are, measurably performing. And yet, at this late date, we still have this alarming statistic that you cited about the depressing state of education philanthropy.
Well, I should be clear on one thing. I was looking at the 50 largest education funders, and there are literally thousands of much smaller funders. So it's quite possible that high-performing nonprofits are getting a good amount of local, kind of smaller funding. But I think it's a real cause for concern when the 50 largest are not having their dollars follow impact. So, I think there could be a variety of different reasons why that happens. Many funders put geographic, there's a simple kind of screen, geographic boundaries on where you fund. And so if a certain proven program is not operating within your geographic boundaries, you're not going to, and if they don't have any interest in coming to, into your geographic boundaries, you're not going to fund it. Those kinds of geographic decisions, I think, are really values-based, and I'm not going to quibble with those. I do think funders have to make decisions at some level about what the scope is of where they're going to invest. But the ones that concern me more are foundations that are choosing, that are choosing to take a pass on organizations simply because it doesn't fit with their theory of change. So. And I'll use an example with Hewlett because I think that's kind of the safest type of failure to talk about as your own. We invested in California education reform for upwards of 6 years just recently. And one of, I said earlier that I think there are very few well-proven solutions to many of these complex social problems. In the education sector, I would say there are a couple that I think do have a level of evidence that is impressive and beyond many of the other solutions. One of those is universal preschool. There's a lot of evidence to show that it travels across locations and different types of populations, et cetera, that if you can get kids into school early, in those formative years for brain development, they do better over the long term. They're ready for kindergarten. They're less likely to drop out from high school. Their achievement is higher. Now, you need to do a bunch of things well. It needs to be a very high-quality program. You need to have follow-up. But universal preschool is an example where at Hewlett, even though that is something that could very well have addressed our interest in raising achievement levels in K-12, we made a decision not to fund universal preschool as part of this California portfolio. And our reasoning was that there were other funders who were already funding that. And so it's an example of choosing investments not based on where the impact is coming from, but based on some sense of kind of territory or ownership of a solution. And I think, I actually think the opposite should happen, that as we prove more and more clearly which solutions are working, we should have an environment where funders can pile on to those effective solutions and make sure that they scale up and reach impact.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. I mean, that does seem to me from some of the nonprofits that I've worked with to be one of the challenges where each funder wants to have some kind of personal ownership and is reluctant to enter a space where some other funders are there. So I applaud you for raising that, and I hope it's something that gets more attention.
Yeah, this theory of change, Nelson. Christy, on the one hand, you seem to be saying a nonprofit needs to have a theory of change, which I think, by now most nonprofits have gotten that message. But the problem is, if you're trying to evaluate the results back at foundation headquarters, don't you need a kind of a master theory of change, right, that allows you to compare your grantees? I mean, if you have a bunch of grantees, all of whom have dramatically different theories of change, how are you? I mean, this is a problem of these measurable outcomes that keeps dogging me whenever I think about this. You tell foundations to evaluate their own performance, right? But then that means they have to have a single standard of performance in order to view their assembled portfolio of grantees. No, I mean, isn't that?
Well, I think that simply having clarity on your outcome goal can help you assess relative performance of one investment versus another and make those trade-offs without having to lock in on an idea about exactly how that goal should be reached.
Also, on that, there are many different ways or many different motivations to measure things. One measure is to understand if a particular intervention is working, randomized control test to really compare in a very aggressive and scientific way option A versus option B. But there's another kind of measurement that's just feedback to get better. And it's judgment. It's asking, how are we doing? It's measurement as learning. And measurement as learning can be as simple as, we have a portfolio. I'm a foundation. We have a portfolio of grantees. Which ones are in the top quartile and which ones are in the bottom quartile? And those conversations that I've had, people generally know. You know what the bottom quartile is. I sat in a boardroom once, the end of a long day, and asked them, okay, it was an off-site meeting. It was a foundation. Very sophisticated, very smart people. Long day. What's the bottom? Tell me about your bottom quartile. They wanted to talk about, getting it. Tell me about your bottom quartile. One guy said, we don't have one. And it stopped the action. And so then finally, they started talking about their bottom quartile, and it turns out they all, that one's pretty bad. There was another dog. Oh boy, God. And, I learned a long time ago that in order to improve, you need to understand what's going on at the top end of the distribution and what's going on at the bottom end. It's true, I think, in life. What's the top 10, 20% that's really clicking, and what's the bottom 10 or 20%? And then you'll learn. So there's measurement to kind of measure, and there's measure to learn. And I think sometimes we get too focused on measurement for the sake of measurement as opposed to measurement just to get better.
Yes. Yeah, Nick, please, right in the back.
Hi, Nick Dachikowski. I'm with the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. There's two things that trouble me in this. One is kind of the image of a marketplace, almost implying that if we, the high-performing nonprofits aren't there, we'll just go to the high-performing ones, or where we can have impact. And then, if we drop out some people or initiatives out of a service area, those can be sometimes have very serious consequences, and they might be better off served by low-performing nonprofits than not at all. The second issue is sort of time frame. I'm actually, one of the things that really scares me is if we get too carried away in that we start becoming too much short-termish. And sometimes, once again, that term high-performing nonprofits, I know that's not in your book, but I know that's a Hewlett term used very often, is nobody's high-performing all the time. That very often the nonprofits don't start off as high performers right away, which is why, Christy, I really like that you talk about experimentation, but experimentation can be inherently contradictory with, with impact, unless you have a long enough time frame. So I'm wondering if you could address these in some way.
Sure, I'll say a little bit. So I actually don't think it ever makes sense to invest in a low-performing nonprofit. I really think there would be a better use of dollars, and that could even be creating something new. I think, but I will say I agree that not all organizations that have a potential to have impact have been proven effective yet. That's why I have such an interest in innovation. In the idea that they're at an early stage of development, there are a lot of, if you want to have innovation, the ability to make breakthroughs, you need to take some flyers on things that are unproven but seem to have potential. So I think it's just as important as I think it is to invest in high-performing nonprofits. I also think it's critical that we reserve funds for innovation, for seeding things that haven't been tried before, that are unproven. But I don't think there should be an endless time period on those. I think we should have an approach where we seed innovations, we let them flower, and then we see which seem to be doing best, and we weed out those that are unsuccessful.
Could I just, taking this one step further, though, the question. Let's pick a city at random, Flint, Michigan, for instance. Charles Stewart Mott Foundation is headquartered in Flint. But you find this the same in any number of cities in the United States. Residents of a 10-block area have finally, had it with drug dealers, right? And they come together to form a nonprofit, and they have various proposals for evicting nonprofits, evicting drug dealers from their. Well, that might be a start. Evicting drug dealers from the neighborhood, and it's it's not terribly imaginative. It's sort of reinventing the wheel in terms of a sophisticated foundation's point of view. But there's some importance to the fact that it's Flint, and okay, it's not state-of-the-art anti-drug strategy, brought in from L.A. but Flint right now, this is pretty good, and this 10 block area has been pretty passive, right, in the face of these problems. And they go to some foundations and ask for some help, and the response they get is, yeah, but your theory of change is kind of a drab, it's old stuff. We know from the experience in Los Angeles this isn't likely to work. Isn't there some room, because it's in your backyard, because it's your city, your town, your locality, your place, as it were? Isn't there some room for funding what might be, by national standards, a mediocre or low performing or low quartile nonprofit?
Let me, I don't think they walk in the door with the label, kind of green, red, yellow, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, remember, philanthropy is personal. That means that the corollary there is that it's also relationship driven. So you said, are you betting on theories of change or betting on people? People is the answer. Okay, period. A theory of change is something that can be captured in a colorful slide or two if you want to, but you're betting on people. And so if those people that came in had strong reputations, were clearly community leaders, were clearly talented, maybe had theory of change that looked like needed some work, bet on the people. Because at the end of the day, as I remember, I said strategy's 10 or 20%, and the rest is actually doing it. Because you want to do it, and you have to do it for years. I mean, this time frame question bump into all the time. It's an interesting, I don't know what the data would say. You guys might have a point of view, but in general, it wouldn't surprise me if individual donors have longer time frames than foundations. Because the whole structure of a foundation lends itself to annual budgeting, unpacking the money to every program area. You have to have a theory of change or your program area doesn't get money. You have to report back. You're competing internally for resources. Whereas the donor says, I grew up in Flint. Last Thursday, I was in Michigan. I was at Grand Rapids, and at this amazing sculpture garden that Fred Meyer and his wife built, meeting with these donors from Grand Rapids. They've done amazing things with donors collaborating with one another, reinvigorating and rebuilding a lot of that downtown area. And, they're betting on each other. They're betting on people in that, and they live there.
Right.
So they are taking a long-term view, whereas you can imagine a national foundation coming in and having the average grant for a foundation is what, 36 months or less? Just averaging world. Well, 36 months, it's not all that long. So I think individual donors investing in their backyards on people that they feel have the capability and groups that they feel have the capability to make a difference. I think that's been going on a long time in America, and I bet on that.
Yeah. And nothing you say in your book would rule that out.
No, not
necessarily.
at all.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would wholeheartedly agree. I would say even in the most low-performing communities or troubled communities, there are always a handful of leaders who are effective, have vision, and are ready to run with it. And so I would imagine no matter where you're interested in investing, you could find some of those leaders and help them grow organizations to carry out their visions.
There's just one footnote, because it isn't in the book, but I talk about it a lot. A lot is different between business and the social sector, but one very simple recipe isn't different. If you want to get results, if you want to achieve something over time, you need two sets of resources and a plan for putting it to work. The sets of resources are people and enough financial support to help those people implement whatever it is they're trying to do, and a plan for putting those resources to work. The least important is the plan. And by the way, a lot of money and the wrong people, that doesn't work either. Right people, adequately financed, not too much money, by the way, is a different kind of problem. The right people, adequately financed with a reasonable plan, the right people are learning. Over time, that's a recipe for success. I mean, you see that in business over and over and over again. You can kind of convince yourself that it's not as much about the people, or that it's just about the money, or that the plan is really the thing. Ain't true.
And yet, isn't there a tendency in the sector to talk about the plan a little too much? Let's say. I mean, in one of the interview you did for Huffington Post, you suggested, and I think probably rightly so, that most of the books and articles that you encountered in this area, pretty quickly got around a basic set of rules, the 6 best ideas and as you say, you're contrasting that with your questions. You approach it with questions, other people approach it with, the 10 right rules of conduct or the 12 best things you should do in philanthropy.
Yeah, Joel's very spiritual. We tried to work with the 10 Commandments, but couldn't couldn't figure it out.
Right.
But I do think the Achilles heel is to go back to, in a way we've all three been talking about, the Achilles heel is what happens Monday morning. It's execution. And it's the back half of the book, not the front half of the book, if you want to think about it that way. And if we're not betting on the right people and the right organizations, are we not funding them adequately? This is where this capacity question is so enormously important. We see this all the time. Donors will fund an organization, but resist having any of that money go to overhead. Now, we know nobody wants to waste money, but the translation to Monday morning is the CEO is burned out because she can't hire a chief operating officer. The finance is a disaster because they only get a bookkeeper, not a CFO. They're using laptops that belong in museums. They're just doing all this stuff that impedes their ability to get the job done because people don't want to invest in quote, overheads, assuming that all overhead's bad. So that capacity problem is another impediment that has nothing to do with, quote, strategy per se, but everything to do with delivering results.
Yes, please, right here. It's on his.
My name is Bridget Slipka, and I have a question about defining failure in philanthropy. And it sounds to me like, from reading the book, that failure is underperformance or philanthropists not being able to get anything done. I would suggest that failure should be defined as harm to the beneficiaries. That there are programs donors fund which actively decrease test scores, and there are programs that actively increase unemployment, or that children have to end up walking further for water that is more harmful, right? So we all know these programs. And this may get to Jeff's problem of accountability. Now you're no longer accountable to yourself, you're accountable to your beneficiaries. And this is mentioned in the book, but from what I recall, it's called secondary risk. And the very word secondary implies to me that it's not nearly as critical as the ego of the philanthropist. So I'd like to just suggest that maybe redefining failure as the ultimate goal, the ultimate beneficiary, be a way that we structure this problem.
What you described definitely sounds like failure to me. One of the problems with philanthropy is it tends to be characterized in popular commentary as pass-fail and nothing in between. And those of us, remember your school days, if you took a pass-fail course versus one with grades, everybody passes, right? I mean, the poor dope that with the football player that didn't show up, once in a while they give him a fail. So we tend to think in pass-fail.
Not if he's a good football player.
Not if he's a good football player. Not at all. He passed. You're out of here.
He's fine.
So, only he was a failing football player.
Yes.
Even moving beyond, what you described, which clearly sounds like failure, to a more nuanced view that it's not just pass-fail. There's a whole series of gradients, and we need to acknowledge where we are in those gradients and learn from it.
Yeah, I think I think one of the strengths of the book is indeed your pretty, again, frank acknowledgement of the degree to which, boy, the failure is, failure seems to be the natural state. If I could grab Jeff's, the natural state seems to be to fail. And the percentage of success in the face of all of the forces that tug and pull and drag at philanthropy, the degree of success is phenomenally rare, almost, isn't it?
I guess I would rephrase to get away from the pass-fail kind of binary is to say underperformance is the natural state. In other words, think about it. If you're a jogger, you're very happy running 12 minutes a mile, and because you're just running 12 minutes, everybody you know runs 12 minutes a mile. You read in the paper, people run that rate. And then one day you're out jogging and somebody runs 11 minutes a mile and they go whoosh by you. You go, what's going on here? And then somebody else runs 9 minutes a mile, or whatever metaphor you want to use. The point is, we could do better. Consistently, no. But we now the big we, I'll elevate it up, we could do better, and there's a lot of things that conspire to make it harder. I mean, it is harder to change, the life of a child, to deal with these complex social issues, whether it's poverty or education, than making widgets. I mean, it's just harder. And a whole bunch of structural reasons make philanthropy a tough tool to use. It doesn't mean it's an effective tool to use. It's just a tough tool to use.
And if I could just underline a point there, I think the real challenge, I think it's actually true abysmal failures are outliers. And what you see most often is just mediocre performance. And so the question for the field is really about how to move. Jim Collins, talks about moving from good to great. I think that's the piece that we really have to look at. Every funder has a portfolio of grantees, and I'll say, there's not a single one of my grantees who couldn't come and do a reasonably good dog and pony show for me about, here are some results we got, and here's a great compelling story here, and let me give you. But the question is, how is their performance relative to what others are doing in the field? Is it good enough? And it gets to this question of that Tom mentioned around segmenting your portfolio and being able to say, what's the bottom quarter of my portfolio? What's the top quarter of my portfolio? What do I see are the themes across those buckets? And how can we move on from the lower performers, even though they may not be failures? But how can we keep driving towards higher and higher performance?
It seems like we don't talk, we do talk about failure and about underperformance, but there is a sense in your question that philanthropy is also capable of harm. In other words, that it's not simply a question of not living up to a particular theory of change, but that there's actual harm done to those who are perhaps the recipients or not the recipients of their grant. I suppose that this is more stark in the advocacy world. You have foundations competing on the one hand for education reform, and funding education reform in a sustained and systematic way, and you have other foundations, in fact, funding the status quo in education. They both can't be right? I mean, and they're in fact the outcome. If the status quo, and I'm not saying that it is, but if the status quo is robbing children of an education, and then the reformers are wrong, and they should, but the reformers are the ones who are really helping children change the way they're being educated for the good. Then the status quo people have got to be wrong, and so there is it seems to me this is a part of, we think about philanthropy almost always exclusively in positive terms, but there is a side to it, and it's somewhat of an unacknowledged side, that there are real consequences to the funding decisions, and even to what we see as, we often laud as long-term positive change. Right? If education, it seems to me, is very stark in this way. I mean, there's millions of dollars flowing in from foundations into really funding status quo policies in education. At the same time, there's great millions of dollars flowing into education reform, particularly from foundations, but also from high net worth individuals. And what's lost in it, in a sense, is the children, of what happens to them in the long term, whether you're chosen to get into a high performing charter school or not. And there's contenders on each side, and they're both philanthropists.
Right. And it's not a question that can be settled simply by test scores or simply in some empirical way, right? Because the various approaches to education reflect, as you suggested earlier, sort of fundamental moral and political judgments about the character of the regime, about the character of education, that aren't reducible to mere test scores, and that one needs to wrestle with those larger questions as well as the specific questions. which allows me to put in a plug for Amy Cass's book, 2 books actually. One, The Perfect Gift on generosity, and the other called Giving Well. Let's see, Doing Good, Giving Well, I think.
Anthology.
Yeah, both anthologies of readings, and the premise, a lot of short stories, poems, religious tracts, the point of which is learning can occur in the moral and spiritual sphere, as well as in the sort of the numbers-oriented sphere. You can get better. You can get better at doing good, not simply by measuring results, but also by thinking through the moral implications of what you're doing and realizing that the Western tradition, and indeed some other traditions, have something quite profound to say about these sorts of questions. We're out of time. Do you want anyone last comments?
I have just one last. Ralph Smith was not able to be here,
Yes.
and I can't channel him,
Right.
but I would say I know there's a certain type of solution that he has really been championing, and I just want to put it out on the table, which is more along the lines of a community design strategy or theory of change. And I just want to, especially for the conversation about Flint and about places where we're not getting the kinds of outcomes we want, I think that's another really important, powerful way to get to high impact is to work with whole communities of stakeholders who are coming together around their concern around solving a particular problem, and then designing a collective strategy for results. And Ralph himself has been in charge of building a massive national campaign for grade level reading to try to get low-income third graders reading on time. And I think that's just a really powerful model that we didn't have a chance to say much about, but also really worth exploring.
Great, thank you. Anything else? No? Well, let's thank our panel for a terrific conversation.
This is a long haul. Are you a new mom?
I have 2 kids at home.
Oh, no. How old? How old?
My youngest is 8 months, and my oldest is 3 years.
Jeez.
So nice to meet you. And I love your product.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no problem.
Hi there. Hi, how are you? Good to see you. Good, thanks.
Yeah. I love EPP. I do. I'm a major fan. We're evolving. I'm a major fan. Lots going on. It's exciting. Redistribution. Oh, I'm sorry, though. What? Redistribution. Oh. Yeah. It's become a little bit viral. Yeah. My poor secretary's overwhelmed. Well, people keep calling up and saying, I want 60 copies or I want 50 copies, or not.